The chapel bells had fallen silent an hour ago, and still Elena Ashford stood at the altar, her white gown pooling around her feet like spilled milk on ancient stone. The priest had long since stopped meeting her eyes, his gaze fixed instead on the worn prayer book in his trembling hands. The villagers who had come to witness her union shuffled in the pews behind her, their whispers rising and falling like the wind through the mountain passes that surrounded their small Transylvanian settlement. She did not turn to look at them. She could not bear to see the pity in their faces, or worse, the satisfaction. Eleanor had always been different, always been too bold, too educated, too unwilling to lower her eyes when the men of the village spoke. Her father, a merchant who had died 3 winters past, had filled her head with books and ideas, they said. He had ruined her for a proper marriage. And yet, when Victor Constantine had asked for her hand, the village had celebrated. Victor, with his easy smile and his family's prosperous farm, had seemed like proof that Elena could be tamed, could be made acceptable. But Victor was not coming. Elena's hands, clutched around a bouquet of white roses that had begun to brown at the edges, trembled. She had picked these flowers herself at dawn, gathering them from the wild bushes that grew near the cemetery, because Victor had once said he loved the scent of roses. The thorns had pricked her fingers, and small drops of her blood had stained the petals. She had thought nothing of it then. Now, the bloodstains seemed prophetic. The priest cleared his throat, a sound like gravel scraping against stone. "Elena," he said quietly, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Perhaps it would be best if you returned home. I am certain there is some explanation. Perhaps young Victor has been delayed on the road." The lie hung in the air between them, transparent and pathetic. Everyone in the chapel knew the truth, even if no one would speak it aloud. Victor Constantine had abandoned her. He had proposed, had courted her with words of devotion, had kissed her hand in the village square where everyone could see, and then, on the morning of their wedding, he had simply vanished. Elena felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been holding her upright and dignified. Without a word, she turned from the altar, her veil trailing behind her like a ghost. The villagers parted before her as she walked down the aisle, their silence more damning than any accusation. She saw old widow Petrov cross herself as Elena passed, as though the humiliation were contagious. She saw the baker's wife lean toward her husband, lips moving in eager gossip. She saw young children staring with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The heavy wooden doors of the chapel groaned as Elena pushed them open. The afternoon air hit her face, cold and sharp with the promise of early autumn. The sky above was the color of old pewter, clouds gathering thick over the jagged peaks of the Carpathian Mountains. In the distance, perched on the highest crag like a great black bird of prey, stood Castle Dracula, its towers piercing the sky. Elena had grown up in the shadow of that castle. Every child in the village knew the stories. The count who lived there was ancient beyond measure, a creature of darkness who fed on the blood of the living. He was death itself, they said, given form and will. Mothers used his name to frighten disobedient children. Men made signs against evil when they passed beneath the castle's shadow. And yet, in all of Elena's 23 years, she had never once seen the count emerge from his stronghold. He was a story, a legend, a nightmare that kept to the darkness where nightmares belonged. She stumbled down the chapel steps, her vision blurred with tears she refused to shed in front of the villagers still watching from the doorway. Her white gown, meant to be pristine and sacred, dragged through the mud of the village street. She did not care. What did it matter now? The dress was supposed to mark the beginning of her new life. Instead, it had become a costume for her public humiliation. Where was she even going? Not home, certainly not to the small cottage she had shared with her aunt since her father's death. Her aunt would be waiting there, and Elena could not face the mixture of sympathy and reproach she knew she would find in the old woman's eyes. "I told you Victor was too good to be true," her aunt would say, and perhaps she would be right, but Elena could not hear those words. Not yet, not while her heart was still bleeding. She walked without direction, her feet carrying her away from the village center, toward the edge of the settlement, where the houses grew sparse and the forest began to encroach upon civilization. The mist was rising from the ground, tendrils of white vapor curling around her ankles. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and the sound sent a shiver down her spine. Elena finally stopped at the base of an old stone fountain that had long since run dry. She sank onto its edge, her legs no longer willing to carry her. The bouquet of roses fell from her hands, scattering across the muddy ground. She stared at them, at the blood-stained petals now trampled and ruined, and something inside her broke completely. A sob tore from her throat, then another, and then she was weeping openly, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. It was not just Victor's betrayal that devastated her, it was everything. The loss of her father. Who would have protected her from this shame? The coldness of the village, which had never truly accepted her. The future she had tried to build, now shattered beyond repair. What would become of her now? A woman abandoned at the altar was marked for life. No other man would want her. She would grow old in her aunt's cottage, a cautionary tale for other young women who dared to dream of happiness. The sound of footsteps on stone made her look up sharply. Through the veil of her tears, she saw figures approaching from the direction of the tavern. 3 men, their faces flushed with drink even in the afternoon. She recognized them. Gregor, the blacksmith's son, who had once tried to court her and had never forgiven her rejection. His 2 companions were farmhands, rough men whose names Elena did not know. Well, Gregor said, his voice slurred and mocking. Look what we have here, the abandoned bride. Not so proud now, are you, Elena? Elena rose to her feet, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Leave me alone, Gregor. He laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the empty buildings around them. Why should I? You never left me alone, did you? Always parading around with your books and your fine words, acting like you were better than the rest of us. And now look at you. Victor saw through you. He saw what you really are. One of the other men stepped closer, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Shame about the dress, he said. Would have been a waste on Victor anyway. Maybe it doesn't have to go to waste. Helena's heart began to pound. The street was empty. The villagers had all returned to their homes, eager to gossip about the day's events over their suppers. No one would come if she screamed. No one would care. She took a step backward, her mind racing. The forest was close, but she would never outrun them in her heavy gown. The chapel was too far, and the priest would not intervene in a matter between villagers. She was alone, as she had always been alone. Gregor reached for her arm, his fingers closing around her wrist. Come now, Elena. Don't make this difficult. You should be grateful for the attention. After today, no one else will want you. The voice that cut through the evening air was like a blade of ice. Remove your hand from the lady. All 4 of them froze. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The voice had come from behind her, from the direction of the forest, and it carried a weight of authority that stopped Gregor's advance as surely as a physical blow. Slowly, Elena turned. The figure that emerged from the mist was tall and impossibly elegant, dressed in black from head to toe. A long cloak hung from his shoulders, lined with crimson silk that seemed to glow in the fading light. His face was pale, almost luminous, with sharp, aristocratic features that appeared carved from marble. His hair was dark, swept back from a high forehead, and his eyes were the most unsettling thing about him. They were dark, fathomless, ancient beyond measure. And when they fixed on Gregor and his companions, all 3 men took an involuntary step backward. Elena knew who he was. Every instinct screamed the truth at her, even as her rational mind struggled to accept it. This was Count Dracula, the creature from the castle on the mountain, the nightmare made flesh. He moved toward them with a grace that was utterly inhuman, his footsteps making no sound on the cobblestones. Gregor's face had gone white, and his companions looked ready to bolt. "My lord," Gregor stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew. "We meant no harm. We were just speaking with the girl." Dracula's gaze did not leave them. "I believe I gave you an instruction," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that promised terrible consequences for disobedience. Gregor released Elena's wrist as though it had burned him. The 3 men began backing away, their eyes wide with terror. "Forgive us, my lord. We did not know she was under your protection." Protection. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Dracula tilted his head slightly, studying the men with the detached interest of a scientist examining insects. "Now you know," he said. Go." They fled. Gregor and his companions turned and ran back toward the village as though pursued by demons, their footsteps echoing in the twilight. Elena watched them go, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, and then, slowly, she turned to face the Count. He was watching her with those dark, fathomless eyes. Up close she could see details that defied nature. His skin was too perfect, too smooth, unmarred by any sign of age despite the ancient quality of his gaze. When he breathed, it seemed more like a habit than a necessity. And yet, despite the obvious wrongness of him, despite everything she had been taught to fear, Elena found she could not look away. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. Dracula regarded her in silence for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he removed his cloak and held it out to her. "You are cold," he observed, "and your dress is ruined." Elena looked down at herself. He was right. The white gown was splattered with mud, torn at the hem where she had tripped on the chapel steps. Her arms were bare, covered in gooseflesh from the evening chill. Slowly she reached out and took the cloak. It was surprisingly warm, lined with silk that felt like liquid against her skin. It smelled of old stone and something else, something she could not quite identify. Not unpleasant, but foreign, ancient. "Why did you help me?" she asked, pulling the cloak around her shoulders. "Everyone says you are a monster." Something flickered in his dark eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or sadness. It was difficult to tell. "I am many things," he said quietly, "but I do not tolerate cruelty to those who cannot defend themselves." Elena swallowed hard. She should run. She should thank him again and flee back to the village, back to the relative safety of her aunt's cottage. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the village no longer felt safe anyway. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something she did not want to examine too closely. "What will happen to me now?" she found herself asking. The question was not really meant for him, but he answered nonetheless. "That depends on what you want to happen." Elena let out a bitter laugh. "What I want? I wanted to be married today. I wanted a home and a husband and a future. Instead, I have nothing. I am ruined. The village will never let me forget what happened today." Dracula studied her for a moment longer, and then inexplicably he held out his hand. The gesture was formal, old-fashioned, like something from another century. "Walk with me," he said. "Just for a moment. Act like you are with me." Elena stared at his extended hand. It was madness to consider it. To be seen with him, to accept his company, would mark her even more thoroughly than Victor's abandonment had. And yet what did she have left to lose? Her reputation was already destroyed. Her future was already ashes. Slowly, Elena placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, cool and steady, and she felt an odd sense of calm wash over her, as though some great decision had been made, and the weight of uncertainty had lifted from her shoulders. They walked together through the village street, the mist rising around them. Elena was acutely aware of eyes watching from windows, of curtains twitching, of gasps and whispers following in their wake. Let them stare, she thought. Let them gossip. What did it matter anymore? "Where are we going?" she asked. Dracula glanced down at her, and for the first time she thought she saw the ghost of a smile on his pale lips. "Away from here," he said, "unless you wish to return to your aunt's cottage and spend the rest of your life as the village's favorite tragedy." Elena thought of her aunt's pitying face, of Gregor's mocking laughter, of Victor's betrayal. She thought of all the years stretching ahead of her, trapped in a place that had never wanted her, surrounded by people who had never understood her. "No," she said softly, "I do not wish to return." Dracula nodded as though he had expected this answer. "Then come," he said. "My carriage waits at the edge of the forest. You will be safe in my home, at least for tonight. Tomorrow, you may decide what you wish to do with your future." Safe. It was a strange word to hear from the mouth of a creature who was supposed to be the embodiment of danger. And yet, as Elena walked beside him, his cloak wrapped around her shoulders and his hand steadying hers, she felt safer than she had in months, perhaps in years. They reached the edge of the village, where the cobblestones gave way to the rutted dirt road that led into the forest. A black carriage waited there, drawn by two massive horses whose eyes seemed to glow red in the fading light. The driver, a hunched figure in a heavy coat, did not turn to look at them. He simply opened the carriage door, revealing plush velvet seats within. Dracula handed Elena up into the carriage with a courtesy that seemed pulled from another age. She settled onto the seat, the white of her ruined wedding dress a stark contrast against the dark interior. He climbed in after her, settling across from her with that same unnatural grace. The door closed. The driver cracked his whip, and the carriage began to move, pulling away from the village, away from the only life Elena had ever known, toward the great black castle on the mountain. Elena looked back once, watching the village recede into the mist. Then she turned forward, toward whatever future awaited her in the darkness ahead. Beside her, silent and still as a statue, Count Dracula watched the road with those ancient, unfathomable eyes, and Elena wondered what she had truly agreed to, and whether she would ever see the sunlight again. The journey up the mountain road seemed to exist outside of time. Elena watched through the carriage window as the forest grew denser, the trees pressing close on either side, like silent sentinels bearing witness to her passage from one world to another. The mist thickened as they climbed, transforming the landscape into something dreamlike and unreal. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of the village far below, the lights in the windows growing smaller and more distant, until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the fog. Count Dracula had not spoken since they entered the carriage. He sat across from her, perfectly still, his dark eyes occasionally catching the faint moonlight that filtered through the clouds. Elena found herself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the creature before her with the monster from the stories. In the tales told around winter fires, Dracula was a beast, a predator who stalked the night in search of victims. But the being who had saved her from Gregor and his companions, who had offered her his cloak and his protection, seemed something else entirely. There was danger in him, certainly. She could feel it radiating from his stillness like heat from a forge, but there was also a profound loneliness, a weight of centuries that hung about him like a shroud. "Why did you really help me?" Elena asked, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded small in the enclosed space of the carriage. "You could have simply walked past. No one would have questioned you." Dracula turned his gaze to her, and Elena felt the full force of those ancient eyes. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. "I do not enjoy watching innocence destroyed by cruelty," he said. "I have seen too much of it in my long existence." "But you barely know me. How do you know I am innocent?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, there and gone in an instant. "I know more than you might think, Elena Ashford. Your father was a good man. He traded with my estate on occasion, bringing books and curiosities from his travels. He spoke of you often, with great pride. When he died, I wondered what would become of the girl he loved so fiercely." Elena's breath caught. "You knew my father. We were not friends, if that is what you are asking. But we had dealings over the years. He was one of the few mortals who did not cross himself and flee when my name was mentioned. He understood that the world is more complex than the simple stories people tell themselves." Tears pricked at Elena's eyes again. But these were different from the tears she had shed at the fountain. Her father had never mentioned any dealings with the Count, but then he had always been protective of her, shielding her from anything he thought might frighten or harm her. To know that he had walked the same halls she was now approaching, that he had spoken with the creature beside her, made this journey feel less like a leap into darkness and more like following in footsteps laid down long ago. "What did he trade with you?" she asked. "Books, primarily. Maps, items of scholarly interest. Your father had a gift for finding rare texts. I have a library that spans centuries, and he helped me add to it. In return, I provided him with gold and certain protections. The roads between here and the larger cities can be dangerous, but no bandits trouble those who travel under my seal." Elena absorbed this information, turning it over in her mind. It explained much about her father's success as a merchant, his ability to travel routes that other traders avoided. It also explained the unusual books that had filled their cottage, the volumes in languages she could not read, the illuminated manuscripts that seemed too valuable for a simple merchant's home. "Did he know what you are?" she asked. Dracula was silent for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. He knew. And unlike most who learn the truth, he did not respond with hatred or fear. He simply accepted it as one more truth about the world. He was a remarkable man. The carriage began to slow, and Elena realized they were approaching the castle gates. Through the window, she could see massive iron barriers rising before them, twisted into elaborate patterns that seemed to writhe in the moonlight. Beyond them, the castle itself loomed, a structure of such imposing darkness that it seemed to have been carved from the mountain itself rather than built upon it. The gates swung open without any visible hand touching them, and the carriage passed through. Elena's heart began to beat faster. This was real. She was truly entering Castle Dracula, the place every child in the village had been taught to fear above all others. And yet, as they passed into the courtyard and the gates closed behind them with a hollow boom, she felt no terror, only a strange sense of inevitability, as though this was where she had always been meant to end up. The carriage door opened, and Dracula stepped out first, then turned to offer Elena his hand. She took it, allowing him to help her down onto the cobblestones. The courtyard was vast, surrounded by high walls and towers that seemed to pierce the clouds above. Ancient statues stood in alcoves, their features worn by wind and time. A fountain stood at the center, its water black as ink in the darkness. "Welcome to my home," Dracula said quietly. "You need not fear anything within these walls. No harm will come to you here." Elena wanted to believe him, but as she looked up at the towering structure before her, at the windows that gazed down like empty eyes, she felt the weight of the castle's age and power pressing down upon her. How many others had passed through these gates? How many had left again? As if reading her thoughts, Dracula said, "You are free to leave whenever you wish. I am not in the habit of keeping prisoners, but for tonight at least, allow me to offer you shelter and safety. Tomorrow, you may decide your path." He led her up a broad flight of stone steps toward the castle's main entrance. The doors were enormous, carved with intricate scenes that Elena could not quite make out in the darkness. They swung open as Dracula approached, revealing a vast entrance hall beyond. Elena stepped inside and stopped, her breath catching. Whatever she had expected, it was not this. The entrance hall was magnificent, a soaring space lit by hundreds of candles in elaborate chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceiling. The walls were lined with tapestries depicting scenes of battle and courtly life from ages past. A grand staircase swept upward, its banister carved from dark wood and polished to a mirror shine. Everything spoke of wealth and power, but also of a time long gone, a world that existed now only in history books and fading memories. "It is beautiful," Elena whispered, unable to stop herself. Dracula's expression softened slightly. "It was once even more so," he said, "when the halls were filled with music and laughter, when life animated these stones. Now it is merely a monument to what was." He gestured toward the staircase. "Come, I will show you to your chambers. You must be exhausted, and I imagine you would like to change out of that dress." Elena looked down at her ruined wedding gown. The white fabric was filthy, torn, a mockery of what it was supposed to represent. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." They climbed the staircase together, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Elena noticed that no servants appeared, no staff bustled about with the business of maintaining such a vast estate. The castle seemed empty save for the two of them, a great hollow monument inhabited only by shadows and memories. "Do you live here alone?" she asked, as they reached the top of the stairs and turned down a long corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced nobles. "For the most part," Dracula replied. "I have a few servants who attend to the castle's needs, but they keep to their own quarters. I prefer solitude. It is easier that way." "Easier than what?" "Easier than remembering what it was like to be surrounded by the living." The sadness in his voice was so profound that Elena felt it like a physical ache in her chest. She wanted to say something, to offer some comfort, but what words could possibly address centuries of loneliness? They stopped before a heavy wooden door. Dracula pushed it open, revealing a bedchamber beyond that took Elena's breath away. The room was spacious and beautifully appointed, with a massive four-poster bed draped in deep crimson velvet. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Candles in silver holders provided additional light, giving the room a warm, almost welcoming glow. A wardrobe stood against one wall, and through an open door, Elena could see a bathing chamber with a large copper tub. "This will be your room for as long as you remain here," Dracula said. "You will find clothing in the wardrobe. Some of it may be old-fashioned, but it should fit you well enough. The bath is drawn and ready. Take whatever time you need to refresh yourself. When you are ready, I will have a meal prepared for you in the dining hall." Elena turned to him, suddenly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. A few hours ago she had been standing at an altar, waiting for a man who would never come. Now she stood in a vampire's castle, being offered kindness by a creature she should fear above all others. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, needing to understand. "What do you want from me?" Dracula met her gaze, and for a moment Elena thought she saw something flicker in those dark eyes. Not hunger, not the predatory gleam she had expected, but something deeper, something almost human. "I want nothing from you," he said softly. "Perhaps I simply wish to prove that not all monsters live in castles, and not all saviors wear the faces of men." He turned to leave, but Elena reached out and caught his sleeve. The fabric was cool beneath her fingers, and she felt him go very still at her touch. "Will you tell me your name?" she asked. "Your real name, not the title everyone uses." He looked down at where her hand rested on his arm, and Elena saw something shift in his expression. A wall coming down, perhaps, or a door opening just a crack. "Vlad," he said finally. "My name was Vlad once, in a life so distant it seems like a dream." "Vlad," Elena repeated, testing the name. It felt strange on her tongue, too human for the being before her, and yet somehow right. "Thank you, Vlad, for saving me today." He nodded once, a formal gesture that seemed pulled from another century, another world. Then he gently disengaged his arm from her grasp and stepped out into the corridor. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Elena alone in the firelit chamber. She stood there for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. Then, slowly, she reached up and began to unfasten the buttons of her wedding dress. The fabric fell away from her body, pooling at her feet like a discarded skin. She stepped out of it and left it lying on the floor, a white ghost of the life she had thought she would have. The bath was indeed ready, steam rising from the copper tub. Elena sank into the hot water with a sigh, feeling the cold and tension of the day seep out of her muscles. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink, washing away the mud and the tears and the memory of Gregor's hands on her wrist. When she finally emerged, she felt cleaner than she had in months, as though she had washed away more than just physical dirt. The wardrobe held an array of dresses, all of them beautiful and clearly expensive, though the styles were indeed old-fashioned from decades or even centuries past. Elena chose a gown of deep blue velvet, simple in cut but elegant, with long sleeves and a high collar. It fit her perfectly, as though it had been made for her body. She braided her damp hair and secured it with pins she found on the vanity, then examined herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was a stranger. Not the village girl who had stood at the altar that morning, not the broken creature who had wept by the fountain. This woman looked composed, dignified, almost regal in her borrowed finery. Elena barely recognized herself. A soft knock at the door made her turn. "Come in," she called. The door opened to reveal not Dracula, but an elderly woman in a simple black dress. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She curtsied slightly. "Begging your pardon, miss. The master sent me to escort you to the dining hall if you are ready." Elena nodded, following the woman out into the corridor. They walked in silence through the castle, down one hallway and then another, past more portraits and tapestries and statues. Elena tried to memorize the route, but the castle was vast and labyrinthine, and she quickly lost her sense of direction. Finally, they arrived at a pair of tall doors. The servant pushed them open, revealing a dining hall that was nearly as impressive as the entrance hall. A long table dominated the space, set with silver and crystal that gleamed in the candlelight. At the far end, Dracula stood by the fireplace, his back to the door. He turned as they entered. "Thank you, Marta," he said to the servant. "You may retire for the evening." The woman curtsied again and withdrew, closing the doors behind her. Dracula gestured to the chair nearest him at the head of the table. "Please sit. You must be hungry." Elena approached the table and sat, suddenly aware of how famished she was. She had not eaten since the night before, too nervous about the wedding to stomach breakfast. Now, presented with an array of dishes, her mouth watered. There was roasted meat, fresh bread, cheese, fruit, wine. A feast fit for nobility. Dracula took his seat at the head of the table but did not reach for any of the food. Elena hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "You are not eating." "I have already dined," he said, a slight emphasis on the last word that made Elena's skin prickle. "But please do not let that stop you. Everything here is for you." Elena picked up her fork and began to eat, trying not to think too hard about what he meant by already dined. The food was excellent, better than anything she had tasted in years. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Dracula watched her in silence. His gaze was not uncomfortable, but it was intense, as though he were studying her, trying to understand something. "May I ask you a question?" Elena said finally, breaking the silence. "Of course. Why did you tell those men I was under your protection? When you found us by the fountain?" Dracula's expression did not change, but Elena sensed something shift in the air between them. "Because in that moment you were," he said simply, "and because I needed them to believe it, or they would not have left you alone. But now everyone in the village will think I have made some kind of bargain with you. They will say I am cursed, or worse." "And would that be so terrible?" Dracula asked. "To be thought cursed by people who were content to watch you be humiliated and attacked? People who never appreciated what you were?" Elena had no answer to that. She returned her attention to her meal, but her appetite had faded. She set down her fork and looked directly at him. "What am I doing here, really?" she asked. "You said I could leave tomorrow, but where would I go? Back to the village? They will never accept me now. To another town? I have no money, no family except my aunt. And she will disown me if she has not already." Dracula leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "You are here because you chose to be," he said. "No magic compelled you to take my hand. No enchantment forced you into my carriage. You came because some part of you recognized that your old life was over and that you needed to step into something new, even if that something is unknown and frightening." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes again, but she blinked them back. "And what is this new life supposed to be?" she asked. "Am I to be your prisoner, your servant, your meal?" The last word came out bitter and angry, and she half expected Dracula to be offended. Instead, he looked almost sad. "You are my guest," he said quietly. "Nothing more and nothing less. You may stay here as long as you wish, and when you are ready to leave, I will provide you with gold and safe passage to wherever you wish to go. Vienna, Paris, London, anywhere beyond the reach of this village and its small, cruel minds. And in return, there must be something you want." Dracula stood and walked to the fireplace, gazing into the flames. "In return," he said, his voice so soft she almost did not hear it, "I ask only that you treat me as something other than a monster, even if only for a little while." Elena stared at his back, at the perfect stillness of him, and felt her heart twist with an emotion she could not name. This creature, this being of such terrible power and age, was asking her for something so simple, to be seen as something other than the nightmare from the stories, to be treated as a person, not a monster. She rose from her chair and walked to where he stood by the fire. They were close now, close enough that she could see the fine details of his face, the impossible perfection of his features. Up close she could see that his stillness was not quite natural, that his chest rose and fell with breath, but the rhythm was wrong, too slow, too measured. And yet when he looked down at her, his eyes held such depth of feeling that she could not doubt his capacity for emotion. "I do not think you are a monster," she said softly. "I think you are lonely, and I think you have been lonely for a very long time." Something flickered across Dracula's face, an expression gone too quickly for her to read. He looked away, back toward the fire. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges. We will talk more then." Elena nodded, though she was not tired. The bath and the meal had revived her, and her mind was racing with questions and possibilities. But she could sense that he needed her to leave, that this conversation had stirred something in him that he did not wish to confront. "Good night, Vlad," she said, using his given name deliberately. He turned sharply at the sound of it, and for a moment they simply looked at one another. Then he inclined his head in that formal, archaic gesture. "Good night, Elena." She left the dining hall and made her way back through the corridors, only getting lost twice before she found her chamber. The fire had been built up while she was gone, and the room was warm and inviting. Elena changed into a nightgown she found folded on the bed, then climbed beneath the covers. The mattress was soft, the blankets warm, and within moments exhaustion claimed her. Elena woke to find pale sunlight streaming through the tall windows of her chamber. For a moment she lay still, disoriented, her mind struggling to reconcile the unfamiliar surroundings with her memories. Then everything came rushing back. The wedding that never was, Victor's betrayal, the encounter with Gregor and his companions, and Dracula, extending his hand to her in the mist-shrouded village street. She sat up slowly, looking around the room with fresh eyes. In daylight, she could see details she had missed the night before. The tapestries on the walls depicted scenes of courtly love and noble hunts, their colors faded, but still beautiful. The furniture was all carved from dark wood, polished to a deep luster. Everything spoke of wealth and refinement from a bygone era, preserved here like insects trapped in amber. A knock at the door startled her. "Come in," she called, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The elderly servant from the previous evening entered, carrying a tray laden with food. "Good morning, miss. The master thought you might be hungry." She set the tray on a small table by the window, then turned to Elena with a slight smile. "I am Marta, the castle housekeeper. If you need anything during your stay, you have only to ask." Elena climbed out of bed and approached the tray. There was fresh bread, butter, honey, sliced fruit and tea that smelled of herbs and flowers. Her stomach growled appreciatively. "Thank you, Marta. This is very kind." The old woman nodded. The master is always generous to his guests. She moved to the wardrobe and began selecting garments. "I have laid out a dress for you. When you are ready, the master wishes to speak with you in his study. I will return in an hour to escort you." After Marta left, Elena ate her breakfast by the window, looking out over the landscape that surrounded the castle. From this height, she could see for miles. The forest stretched in all directions, dark and dense, broken only by the occasional clearing. Far below, barely visible through the morning mist, she could make out the village where she had spent her entire life. From here it looked insignificant, a handful of buildings clustered together against the vastness of the mountains. How small her world had been, how narrow the confines of her existence. She had never traveled beyond the neighboring villages, had never seen the great cities her father spoke of when he returned from his journeys. She had been content with her books and her dreams, believing that marriage to Victor would be enough. Now, looking down from this ancient castle, she felt as though she were seeing herself from a great distance, understanding for the first time how limited her ambitions had been. She finished her breakfast and dressed in the gown Marta had selected, a dress of deep green that complemented her dark hair and fair skin. As she fastened the buttons, she noticed that the style was not as antiquated as the other dresses in the wardrobe. This one could have been made within the last decade, though it still had a timeless quality to it. When Marta returned, she led Elena through a different series of corridors than they had taken the night before. The castle was truly massive, and Elena wondered how many rooms it contained, how many chambers stood empty and unused. They passed windows that looked out over inner courtyards and towers, past doors both open and closed, some revealing libraries and sitting rooms, others concealing spaces Elena could only imagine. Finally, they arrived at a heavy oak door. Marta knocked once, then pushed it open. "The master will see you now, miss." Elena entered the study and stopped, her breath catching. If she had been impressed by the library glimpsed through doorways, this room surpassed it entirely. 3 walls were lined floor to ceiling with books, thousands of them, their leather spines bearing titles in languages she recognized, and many she did not. The 4th wall was dominated by tall windows that flooded the room with light. A massive desk stood before the windows, its surface covered with papers, maps, and more books. Dracula stood by one of the windows, his back to the door. In the daylight, Elena expected him to look different somehow, diminished or revealed. Instead, he appeared exactly as he had in the darkness, pale, elegant, utterly still except when he chose to move. He wore black as before, but the cut was simpler, almost scholarly. "Good morning, Elena," he said without turning. "I trust you slept well. Very well. Thank you." Elena approached slowly, her eyes drawn to the books surrounding them. "This collection is remarkable." Dracula turned to face her, and Elena noticed he was holding a small leather-bound volume. "It is the work of centuries," he said. "Books were once among the few companions I allowed myself. They do not age as mortals do, though they are perhaps more fragile in their own way." He gestured to a chair near his desk. "Please, sit. There is much we should discuss." Elena settled into the chair, arranging her skirts carefully. Dracula moved to sit behind his desk, placing the book he had been holding gently on the surface between them. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I have been thinking about our conversation last night," he began. "You asked what you're doing here, and I gave you an answer that was true but incomplete. The truth is more complicated." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. "Go on." Dracula leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him in that characteristic gesture. "Last evening, when I came upon you in the village, it was not by chance. I had been watching the chapel from a distance. I knew about your wedding, and I knew that your betrothed would not appear." Elena felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. "You knew? How?" "Victor Constantine came to this castle 3 nights ago, seeking an audience with me. It took all her willpower not to stand, not to demand answers." Dracula's voice remained calm, almost gentle, as he continued. "He brought with him a proposal. He had heard stories, you see, about the creature who lived in this castle. He had heard that I could be hunted, perhaps even destroyed, if the right measures were taken, and he thought he had found a way to accomplish this." Elena's hands clenched in her lap. "What did he propose?" Dracula's eyes never left her face. "He proposed to use you as bait, to bring you here as my bride, to gain access to my home and my trust. Once inside, he and his companions would strike. Vampire hunters, Elena. A small group of them, who have been operating in the surrounding territories for years, destroying my kind wherever they find us." The room seemed to tilt around Elena. She gripped the arms of her chair, trying to steady herself. "Victor was working with vampire hunters. He wanted to use me to kill you?" "Yes. In exchange, they would pay him handsomely. Enough to buy land in a larger city, to leave this region entirely. Your marriage was never meant to be real. You were simply a means to an end." Elena felt sick. All those weeks of courtship, all those pretty words and promises, had been nothing but lies. Victor had never loved her. He had simply seen an opportunity to use her connection to books and learning, her father's former relationship with the castle, as a way to gain access to Dracula. "Why did you not tell me this last night?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you had already suffered enough betrayal for one day, and because I wanted you to have one night of peace before learning the full extent of what was done to you." Elena looked down at her hands, fighting back tears. "So everything was a lie. My entire life these past months was built on deception. Not everything." Dracula's voice was soft. "Your kindness was real. Your intelligence was real. Your capacity for compassion was real. Victor's deception says nothing about who you are. It speaks only to his own moral bankruptcy." Elena took a shaky breath, trying to compose herself. "What happened to Victor? Where is he now?" Dracula's expression darkened. "He and his companions are no longer a threat. I dealt with them before coming to the village yesterday." Elena looked up sharply. "You killed them?" "I did what was necessary to protect myself, and, as it turned out, to protect you. The hunters were prepared to take you as well if their plan failed. They could not risk you revealing their presence in the region." The implications of this sank in slowly. If Dracula had not intervened, if things had gone differently, she would have been killed by the very men her supposed betrothed had conspired with. The betrayal cut even deeper than she had imagined. "So I was never safe," she said. "Not in the village, not with Victor, nowhere. You are safe now." Dracula leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "That is why I brought you here. Not just to save you from humiliation or from Gregor's violence, but because I knew that as long as you remained in the village, you were in danger. The hunters had been watching you for weeks. They knew where you lived, knew your routines. They would have come for you eventually. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. How long have you known about all of this? Long enough to form a plan of my own. He picked up the leather-bound book from his desk and held it out to her. This belonged to your father. He left it in my care years ago, asking me to give it to you if anything should happen to him. I should have delivered it sooner, but I was waiting for the right moment. Perhaps that moment is now. Elena took the book with trembling hands. The leather was worn and soft, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully and saw her father's familiar handwriting covering the pages. It was a journal, filled with his thoughts and observations from his travels. My father wanted me to have this. He wanted you to understand the world as it truly is, not as the village would have you believe it to be. He knew that you were too intelligent, too curious to be satisfied with the narrow life that awaited you there. This journal contains truths he learned during his journeys, truths about creatures like me, about the hidden world that exists alongside the mortal one. He hoped that someday you might understand. Elena turned the pages slowly, her eyes catching phrases here and there, references to vampires, to ancient bloodlines, to the weight of immortality. Her father had known so much more than he had ever revealed to her. He had walked in both worlds, the mundane and the supernatural, and he had kept this knowledge hidden to protect her. Why are you showing me this now, she asked. Because you deserve to know the truth. All of it. You deserve to make an informed choice about your future, and you cannot do that if you do not understand the nature of what I am and the world I inhabit. Dracula rose from his chair and walked to the window, gazing out over the forest. I am not human, Elena. I have not been human for more than 5 centuries. I was born Vlad Dracula, son of Vlad Dracul, Prince of Wallachia. I fought wars, ruled territories, made decisions that cost thousands of lives. And when I fell in battle, when I should have died with honor, I was offered a different fate, immortality, in exchange for my humanity. I accepted, believing I could use that power to protect my people, to ensure that no foreign invader would ever conquer my lands. He turned to face her, and Elena saw such profound sadness in his eyes that it hurt to look at him. But immortality is not power, it is a curse. I have watched everyone I loved turn to dust. I have seen empires rise and fall. I have existed for so long that most of my mortal life feels like a dream, something that happened to someone else. And the price for this existence is blood. Always blood. The blood of the innocent, taken so that I might continue to walk this earth. Elena set the journal down on the desk, her hands no longer steady enough to hold it. Are you telling me this to frighten me, to make me leave? I am telling you this because you need to understand what I am if you choose to remain here. I am not the nobleman you might imagine when you look at this castle and these fine things. I am a predator who has learned to wear the mask of civilization. I feed on human blood to survive. I have killed more people than I can count or remember. And though I have tried over the centuries to limit the harm I cause, to take only from those who will not be missed or who deserve punishment, the fundamental truth remains. I am a monster, Elena. Perhaps not the monster from the village stories, but a monster nonetheless. The room fell silent. Elena could hear her own heartbeat, loud in her ears. She should be terrified. She should be running from this room, demanding that Marta help her leave this castle immediately. Instead, she found herself thinking about the loneliness she had heard in his voice the night before, about the way he had saved her from Gregor without asking for anything in return, about the gentleness with which he had offered her his cloak. Everyone is a monster in someone's story, she said finally. Victor betrayed me and was willing to let hunters kill me for money. The villagers stood by and watched while Gregor and his friends threatened me. Even my aunt will likely disown me for coming here. Who among them has the right to call anyone else a monster? Dracula shook his head. You do not understand what you are saying. The things I have done cannot be compared to mortal cruelty. Elena stood, moving to face him by the window. Perhaps not. But I have spent my entire life being told what to think, how to behave, who to trust, and every authority I ever believed in has proven false. My father, who I loved, kept enormous secrets from me. Victor, who I thought would be my husband, planned to use me as bait for hunters. The village, which should have protected me, cast me aside the moment I became inconvenient. So forgive me if I am no longer willing to accept someone else's definition of what makes a monster." They stood facing each other, the morning light streaming between them. Elena could see every detail of Dracula's face, the perfect pale skin, the dark eyes that held centuries of memory, and she could also see the uncertainty there, the surprise at her words. "What are you saying?" he asked quietly. "I'm saying that I would like to stay here at least for a while longer. I'm saying that I would like to learn about the world my father knew, the one that exists beyond the narrow confines of village life. And I'm saying that if you truly want someone to see you as more than a monster, then I am willing to try." Dracula stared at her for a long moment. "Elena, this is not a decision to be made lightly. If you stay here, if you associate yourself with me, there will be consequences. Other hunters will come eventually. The village will turn completely against you. You will never be able to return to your old life." "I do not want my old life." Elena surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. "My old life was built on lies and limitations. Here, in this castle, surrounded by books and history and truth, I feel more awake than I have in years. I do not know what the future holds, but I know I cannot go back." Dracula's expression shifted, something like hope flickering in his ancient eyes. "Very well," he said, "then you shall stay. But I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that if you ever change your mind, if you ever come to fear me or regret this choice, you will tell me. I will not hold you here against your will. You will always be free to leave." Elena extended her hand, a mirror of the gesture he had made in the village. "I promise." He took her hand, his fingers cool and steady around hers. "Then welcome Elena Ashford to Castle Dracula. May you find here what you could not find in the world below." As their hands clasped, Elena felt something shift in the air around them, as though a pact had been sealed. She did not know what lay ahead, but for the first time since her father's death, she felt as though she was moving toward something rather than away from it. The future was uncertain and possibly dangerous, but it was hers to choose, and that, she realized, was freedom of a kind she had never known. The days that followed took on a rhythm unlike anything Elena had known before. She woke each morning to find breakfast waiting in her chamber, prepared by the silent martyr, who seemed to anticipate her needs before Elena herself knew them. After eating, she would make her way to Dracula's study, where he had begun to teach her about the hidden world her father had discovered. The education was unlike anything she had received from her village tutors. Dracula spoke of history not as a series of distant events, but as lived experience. He described the fall of Constantinople with the detail of someone who had walked its streets. He discussed the politics of medieval Europe with the intimacy of someone who had negotiated with its kings. And slowly, carefully, he began to reveal the truth about creatures like himself. Vampires were not the mindless monsters of village legend, he explained one afternoon as they sat in the library. They were beings caught between life and death, sustained by blood, but still capable of thought, emotion, and even growth. Some embraced their nature fully, becoming the predators that mortals feared. Others, like himself, struggled to maintain some connection to their lost humanity. "Is that why you surround yourself with books?" Elena asked, running her fingers along the spine of a volume written in a language she did not recognize. "To remember what it was like to be human." Dracula looked up from the map he had been studying. "Perhaps, or perhaps I simply need something to fill the endless hours of immortality. When you cannot die, you must find ways to make existence bearable. That sounds like a terrible burden. It is." He set down the map and moved to stand by the window, his customary position when their conversations turned toward difficult truths. Immortality seems like a gift until you possess it. Then you realize it is a prison with no walls. You watch everyone you care about age and die while you remain unchanged. You see the same patterns repeat across centuries, humanity making the same mistakes again and again, and you are powerless to stop it. Eventually, most of my kind simply stop caring. They become the monsters that mortals believe them to be, because it is easier than carrying the weight of remembering what they once were. But you have not stopped caring, Elena observed. If you had, you would not have saved me. You would not be teaching me these things. Dracula turned to face her, and Elena saw something vulnerable in his expression. Your father once asked me a question, he said quietly. He asked what I feared most. I told him the truth. I fear that one day I will wake and discover that I have forgotten how to feel anything at all, that I will have become truly dead, even though I still walk and speak and feed. Your presence here reminds me that I am not there yet, that some part of me still remembers what it means to care about another person. The admission hung in the air between them. Elena set down the book she had been holding and approached him slowly. How long has it been since you had a companion? She asked. Someone who stayed here by choice. Centuries. The last person who lived in this castle and knew what I was, who chose to remain anyway, died before you were born. Since then, there has been only solitude broken by brief transactions with mortals like your father. Necessary interactions, but not companionship. Elena found herself standing very close to him now, close enough to see the fine details of his face, the way the afternoon light played across his pale skin. That is a very long time to be alone. Yes. Dracula's voice was barely above a whisper. It is. For a moment they simply stood there, the vast library silent around them. Elena felt her heart beating faster, felt a strange pull toward this ancient being who had shown her more kindness in a few days than most mortals had in years. It would be so easy to reach out, to close the small distance between them, but something held her back. Fear, perhaps, or caution, or simply the knowledge that whatever was growing between them was too fragile to rush. The spell was broken by the sound of distant thunder. Both of them turned to look out the window, where dark clouds had begun to gather over the mountains. A storm was coming, moving fast across the peaks. We should return to the main hall, Dracula said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. These mountain storms can be severe. They left the library together, walking side by side through the corridors. Elena had learned her way around some parts of the castle by now, though vast sections remained unexplored. The building was so large that she suspected she could spend months here and still not see every room. As they descended the grand staircase, the first drops of rain began to pelt against the windows. By the time they reached the main hall, the storm had arrived in full force. Wind howled around the castle walls and lightning flashed, illuminating the space in stark bursts of white light. Thunder followed, so loud it seemed to shake the very stones beneath their feet. Elena moved to the windows, watching the storm with fascination rather than fear. In the village, storms had always felt threatening, a reminder of nature's power over fragile human structures. Here, in this ancient fortress, the storm felt different, wild and beautiful, but unable to touch them within these massive walls. You are not afraid, Dracula observed, coming to stand beside her. Should I be? Most mortals would be. This castle has stood for centuries, but it still feels vulnerable when the elements rage. Elena shook her head. I feel safer here than I ever did in the village. There, I was always afraid of what people would say, what they would think, whether I was behaving properly. Here, the only thing I need to fear is honest danger, not judgment and gossip. A flash of lightning illuminated Dracula's face, and Elena saw something like admiration in his expression. You are remarkably brave, he said, or remarkably foolish. I have not yet decided which. Perhaps both, Elena replied with a slight smile. They watched the storm together in comfortable silence. After a while, Dracula spoke again. Tell me about your father. What was he like when he was not trading in books and curiosities? Elena felt a familiar ache in her chest at the mention of her father, but it was gentler now, softened by time and by the strange new life she had found. He was kind, she said, and curious about everything. He would spend hours examining a single flower, trying to understand how it grew, why its petals were shaped the way they were. He taught me to read when I was very young, and he never treated my questions as foolish, no matter how strange they might have been. He sounds like a good man. He was. Elena paused, then added, I think he would have liked to see me here, learning from you. He always said that knowledge was more valuable than gold, that understanding the world was the greatest gift anyone could receive. He would have been proud of you. Not many people would have had the courage to stay here, to seek understanding rather than fleeing in terror. Elena turned to look at him. "Are you so terrible that most people flee?" Dracula's expression grew somber. "Yes," he said simply, "I am. You have seen only a small part of what I am, Elena. The civilized part, the part that still remembers how to be gentle. But there is another side to my nature, one that emerges when the hunger becomes too strong or when I am threatened. That side is not gentle. That side is the monster from the stories." "Show me," Elena said impulsively. Dracula drew back slightly, surprise flickering across his features. "What? Show me your true nature. If I am to stay here, if I am to truly understand what you are, then I should see all of it. Not just the scholar who teaches me about history, but the predator you claim to be." "Elena, I do not think you understand what you are asking." "Then help me understand." She held his gaze steadily. "You said you feared becoming truly dead inside. You said my presence reminds you that you can still feel, but you are also asking me to accept only part of who you are. That is not fair to either of us." Dracula stared at her for a long moment, conflict clear in his ancient eyes. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Very well. But do not say I did not warn you." He took a step back from her, and as Elena watched, something began to change. It was subtle at first. His eyes seemed to darken, the pupils dilating until they were nearly black. His lips parted slightly, revealing teeth that were suddenly sharper, more prominent. The air around him seemed to grow colder, and Elena felt the hairs on her arms stand up. But it was more than just the physical changes. There was a presence about him now, something predatory and ancient that pressed against her awareness like a weight. This was not the courtly nobleman or the patient scholar. This was something far older, something that had hunted in the darkness for centuries. Elena's instincts screamed at her to run, to put distance between herself and this creature that her most basic survival responses recognized as a threat. And yet, she stood her ground. Her heart raced and her hands trembled, but she did not move. She forced herself to look at him, to truly see him in this transformed state. "This is what I am," Dracula said, and his voice was different now, deeper, with an edge of something inhuman. "This is the creature that must feed on blood to survive. This is the predator that has killed thousands over the centuries. This is the monster, Elena." Elena swallowed hard, fighting down her fear. "I see you," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "And I am afraid, but I am not running." Dracula's expression shifted, surprise mixing with the predatory intensity. "Why not?" "Because being afraid does not mean I should run. Being afraid means I am being honest about the danger, but I have made my choice. I choose to stay." For a moment longer, Dracula remained in that transformed state, his dark eyes fixed on her. Then, gradually, the changes reversed. His features softened, his teeth became less prominent, and the oppressive presence that surrounded him faded. He looked away from her, and Elena thought she saw shame in his expression. "You should not have asked to see that," he said quietly. "Probably not, but I needed to know." Thunder crashed overhead, and the castle shook with the force of it. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets. In the flashing light, Elena could see Dracula's profile, and she realized that he looked more human now than he had moments before. Vulnerable, even. "Elena," he said without turning to face her, "you must understand something. The hunger is always there. Every time I am near you, I am aware of your heartbeat, of the blood moving through your veins. My nature demands that I feed, and you are living prey in my home. I have learned control over the centuries, but control is not the same as safety. If you stay here, you will always be in some degree of danger." "I know," Elena said, "and I am choosing to stay anyway." He finally turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw such conflicted emotion that it took her breath away. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you risk this?" Elena took a moment to consider her answer, wanting to be honest with both him and herself. "Because loneliness is also dangerous," she said finally. "Because living a safe, small life in the village would have killed something essential in me, even if my body survived. Because I would rather live fully and dangerously than exist safely and numbly." And because I think that beneath the monster you show me, there is still a man who remembers what it means to care for someone, and that man deserves not to be alone. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the great hall, silence fell between them. Dracula moved closer to her slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat. When he was close enough to touch, he raised one hand and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were cool against her skin, and Elena felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with fear. "You are either the bravest person I have ever met," he said softly, "or the most foolish. Perhaps both, as you said. But I am grateful for your presence here, even as I fear what it might cost you." "What might it cost you?" Elena asked. Dracula's hand dropped back to his side. "Everything," he said. "It would cost me everything. Because if I allow myself to care for you, truly care, then I will once again be vulnerable to the pain of loss. And that pain, for creatures like me, is a kind of death worse than the physical one we cannot achieve." Elena reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Then we will both be brave," she said, "and we will both be foolish together." He looked down at their joined hands, and Elena saw something break in his expression. Some wall he had built around himself over centuries, cracking and crumbling. He squeezed her fingers gently, carefully, as though afraid his strength might hurt her. "Together," he repeated, as though testing the word. "It has been so long since I have been anything with anyone, then perhaps it is time to remember how." They stood together in the great hall as the storm raged around the castle, two beings from different worlds, united by loneliness and the fragile hope that perhaps they might find in each other, something they had both thought lost forever. Outside, lightning split the sky and thunder shook the mountains, but within the ancient walls of Castle Dracula, something new was being born, something neither of them fully understood yet, but both were willing to explore. Elena did not know what the future would bring. She did not know if the happiness she felt in this moment would last, or if the dangers Dracula spoke of would ultimately destroy them both. But she knew that she had made the right choice. She had chosen truth over comfortable lies, danger over safe mediocrity, and the possibility of love over the certainty of loneliness. And as she stood there with her hand in his, watching the storm paint the windows with rain and lightning, Elena felt more alive than she ever had in her 23 years. Whatever came next, whatever trials awaited them, she would face them with her eyes open and her heart willing. Because this, she realized, was what it meant to truly live. Not to exist safely within the boundaries others set, but to step beyond them and discover what lay on the other side. The storm would pass. Morning would come. And when it did, Elena would still be here in this castle with this creature who was so much more than the stories claimed. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would write their own story, one that the village could never understand and would never approve of. But it would be theirs, authentic and true, built on honesty and acceptance, rather than lies and fear. And that, Elena thought as thunder crashed overhead and Dracula's hand tightened around hers, was worth any risk. The weeks that followed the storm marked a transformation in the life of Castle Dracula. Elena had begun to think of it not as a prison or even a sanctuary, but as home. She spent her days in the library, devouring books in languages she was learning to read, her mind expanding with each page turned. Dracula proved to be a patient and thorough teacher, guiding her through texts on history, philosophy, natural science, and the hidden lore of supernatural beings that walked unseen among humanity. But it was the evenings that Elena treasured most. After the sun set and darkness claimed the mountain, Dracula seemed to come more fully alive. They would walk together through the castle's many corridors, and he would tell her stories of the rooms they passed. This chamber had once hosted a gathering of nobles from across Europe. That gallery had displayed paintings by masters whose names were now lost to history. Here, in this small sitting room, his mortal wife had spent her afternoons doing needlework before illness claimed her 500 years ago. Elena listened to these stories with a mixture of fascination and sorrow. Each memory Dracula shared revealed the depth of all he had lost. Wives, children, friends, an entire way of life that had crumbled into dust while he remained unchanged. She began to understand that immortality was not power, but exile, a perpetual banishment from the natural flow of life and death that gave mortal existence its meaning. One evening, as autumn deepened and the first snow dusted the mountain peaks, Dracula led Elena to a part of the castle she had not yet explored. They climbed a narrow spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever, until finally they emerged onto a high tower overlooking the surrounding landscape. The view stole Elena's breath. From this height she could see the entire valley spread below them, the forest dark and vast, the village a cluster of lights that seemed impossibly distant. Above, the stars blazed with a clarity she had never witnessed before, undimmed by clouds or firelight. "I come here sometimes," Dracula said quietly, "when the weight of memory becomes too heavy. From this height the world seems both larger and smaller. The concerns of mortals fade to insignificance, and yet I'm reminded of how vast existence truly is, how small my own suffering in the face of infinity." Elena moved to stand beside him at the tower's edge, her cloak whipping in the mountain wind. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The choice to become what you are?" Dracula was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. "Every day for 5 centuries," he said finally. "And yet, if given the choice again, I do not know if I would choose differently. In my mortal life I was a warrior, a prince, a man who believed that strength and will could shape the world. When I was offered immortality, I saw it as the ultimate power, a way to protect my people forever. I did not understand that the price would be watching everyone I sought to protect die while I endured." He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face seemed carved from marble, beautiful and terrible and infinitely sad. "But if I had chosen death that day on the battlefield, I would never have met your father. I would never have collected these books, preserved this knowledge, and I would never have stood on this tower with you, Elena Ashford, who chose to see me as something other than a monster." Elena felt tears sting her eyes. "I do not think you are a monster," she said. "I think you are a man trapped in a curse, trying to hold on to his humanity despite impossible odds." Dracula reached out and gently wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. His touch was cool but gentle, and Elena leaned into it without thinking. "You give me too much credit," he murmured. "I have done terrible things. I have taken lives without hesitation when I deemed it necessary. I have watched civilizations fall and done nothing to prevent it. I am stained with sins that no amount of time can wash away." "And yet you saved me," Elena said, "when you could have simply walked past, when helping me gained you nothing but complications." "It gained me you." The words were barely audible, almost lost in the wind. "And that is worth more than you know." They stood close together on the tower, the night wrapped around them like a cloak. Elena felt her heart beating faster, felt the pull of something deeper than gratitude or friendship. She had known for weeks that her feelings for Dracula had grown beyond simple appreciation for his kindness. But standing here, with his hand still touching her face and his ancient eyes fixed on hers, she could no longer deny the truth. She was falling in love with him. Perhaps she had been since the moment he offered his hand in the village street and asked her to act like she was with him. Perhaps even before that, in some way she had not understood until now. "Vlad," she whispered, using the name he had given her on their first night together. "I need to tell you something." Before she could continue, he pressed a finger gently to her lips. "I know," he said softly. "I can hear it in your heartbeat, see it in the way you look at me. And I must tell you that what you feel is dangerous, Helena. For both of us. Why? Because you might hurt me. Because I already care for you more than is wise. Because if I allow myself to love you, if I permit this connection to deepen, then I will once again know the agony of watching someone I cherish age and die while I remain frozen in this cursed existence. I have endured that pain before, and it nearly destroyed what little humanity I had left." Helena reached up and took his hand from her lips, holding it between both of hers. "Then turn me," she said. "Make me like you." Dracula recoiled as though she had struck him. "No," he said sharply. "Absolutely not." "Why not? If you fear losing me to age and death, then remove death from the equation. You have that power." Dracula pulled his hand from hers and moved away, his expression anguished. "You do not understand what you are asking. To become a vampire is not to gain immortality. It is to lose everything that makes life worth living. The sun becomes your enemy. Food and drink lose all taste. The natural world that you love to explore becomes a reminder of all you have lost. And the hunger, Elena, the constant hunger for blood, for the lives of others to sustain your own cursed existence. You would not wish that on anyone you loved. I would wish it if it meant we could be together. At what cost? Dracula turned to face her again, and his eyes blazed with intensity. Your humanity, your soul, the possibility of eventual peace in death. I will not do that to you, Elena. I will not condemn you to this existence, no matter how much I might want to keep you with me forever. Elena felt frustration rising in her chest. So what are you saying? That we can never be together? That I should leave now before we both become more attached? I am saying that I do not know what the answer is. Dracula's voice broke slightly, revealing the depth of his emotion. I am saying that for the first time in centuries, I want something I cannot have. I want you, Elena. I want to keep you here to spend whatever years you have by your side, but I also want you to have the life you deserve, the natural span of years, the possibility of children and grandchildren, of growing old and dying peacefully in your sleep. I want contradictory things, and I do not know how to reconcile them. Elena moved to him and took his face between her hands, forcing him to look at her. Then let us take what time we have, she said firmly. Let us not waste the years worrying about their end. If we have 10 years or 50 years or 1 year, let us make them count. Let us be happy, Vlad, for however long we are given. Dracula searched her eyes, and Elena saw the war raging behind his gaze. The desire to accept her offer warred with his better judgment, his protective instincts clashing with his desperate loneliness. Finally, something in him broke. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her with a care that belied his inhuman strength. I am selfish enough to want this, he whispered against her hair. God forgive me. I am selfish enough to take what you offer, even knowing the pain it will bring us both in the end. Elena wrapped her arms around him in return, feeling the coolness of his body through his clothes, feeling the absence of a heartbeat that should have been there. None of it mattered. What mattered was that he was real, that he cared for her, that for the first time in her life she felt truly seen and valued for who she was. They stood together on the tower as the stars wheeled overhead, two impossible souls finding solace in each other's embrace. Below them, the village slept, unaware that the woman they had cast aside had found something infinitely more precious than the conventional life they had offered. Above them, the cosmos continued its eternal dance, indifferent to the small drama playing out on this remote mountain peak. Eventually, the cold became too much, even for Elena's determination to ignore it. Dracula felt her shiver and reluctantly released her. Come, he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Let us return to the warmth of the castle. They descended the spiral staircase hand in hand, neither willing to break the physical connection between them. When they reached the main hall, Dracula paused, as though weighing his next words carefully. Elena, he said, if we are to do this, if we are truly to attempt what you suggest, then there must be honesty between us. Complete honesty, no matter how difficult, of course. Then you must know that the village has not forgotten you. Word has spread of your presence here, and there are those who believe you are under my thrall, that I have bewitched you or made you my prisoner. There has been talk of another group of hunters coming to the region, seeking to destroy me and rescue you. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Let them come. I will tell them the truth, that I am here by choice. They will not believe you. To them, any woman who would choose to live with a vampire must be under supernatural influence. They will try to take you by force. Then I will fight them. Elena's voice was hard with determination. I have made my choice, Vlad. I chose you. I chose this life, and I will defend that choice against anyone who tries to take it from me. Dracula looked at her with an expression that mixed admiration and concern. You may have to do more than fight with words, he said quietly. If hunters come, if they threaten this castle and your presence here, things will become violent. I will protect you with everything I am, but there will be blood spilled. Can you accept that? Elena thought of Victor, who had betrayed her so thoroughly. She thought of the village that had abandoned her the moment she became inconvenient. She thought of all the years of being told she was too bold, too educated, too different to deserve happiness. Yes, she said firmly. I can accept that. Whatever comes, we face it together. Dracula pulled her close again, and this time, when he bent his head to hers, Elena rose on her toes to meet him. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deeper, more passionate. Elena felt Dracula's control waver, felt the predator beneath the gentleman surge forward. His lips parted, and she felt the sharp edge of his fangs brush against her lower lip. A tiny point of pain, and then the warm trickle of blood. Dracula jerked back immediately, his eyes wide with horror. Elena, I am sorry. I did not mean to. Elena touched her finger to her lip, then looked at the small smear of blood there. It does not hurt, she said softly, and I am not afraid. She reached up and pulled him back down to her, claiming his mouth again. This time Dracula did not pull away. The taste of her blood was on both their lips, a seal between them more binding than any spoken vow. When they finally parted, both of them were breathing hard, and Elena could see the struggle for control on Dracula's face. Go to your chamber, he said, his voice strained. Please, Elena, I need a moment to master myself, or I will do something we both might regret. Elena nodded, understanding the danger even as part of her wanted to stay, to push this moment further. She touched his face one more time, then turned and walked toward the staircase that led to her chamber. She could feel his eyes on her the entire way, could sense the tension radiating from him. When she reached her room, she found that her hands were shaking. She touched her lip again, feeling the tiny wound already beginning to heal. That small exchange of blood had felt more intimate than any touch she had ever known. It was a promise, a bond, a crossing of the line between mortal and immortal that could never be fully undone. Elena moved to the window and looked out over the moonlit landscape. Somewhere out there, hunters might be gathering. Somewhere in the village below, people were likely plotting her rescue from a captivity that existed only in their imagination. Let them come, she thought. Let them try to take from me the only happiness I have ever known. She would fight for this. She would fight for him. She would fight for the right to choose her own path, no matter how unconventional or dangerous that path might be. And if in the end it cost her everything, at least she would have lived fully, loved completely, chosen freely. The door to her chamber opened, and Elena turned to see Dracula standing in the doorway. He had not knocked, and there was something wild in his expression, something that should have frightened her, but instead made her heart race with anticipation. I tried to stay away, he said, his voice rough. I tried to give you space to do the right thing, but I find I cannot. I have existed for 5 centuries doing the right thing, denying myself, maintaining control. Tonight I find I no longer wish to. Elena walked to him slowly, giving him every opportunity to change his mind. When she reached him, she took his hand and placed it over her heart, letting him feel the rapid beating there. Then stop doing the right thing, she whispered. Just for tonight, be with me. Choose happiness over caution. Choose us. Dracula's control shattered. He pulled her against him, lifting her easily, and carried her to the bed. They came together with a passion that was part desperation, part discovery. 2 souls that had been alone too long, finding solace in each other's arms. Elena felt his cool lips on her throat, felt the careful restraint he maintained even in the heights of passion, never allowing his hunger to overcome his care for her. Later, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Elena felt a peace she had never known. Dracula's fingers traced gentle patterns on her skin, and she could feel the tension in him easing, the walls he had built around himself crumbling a little more with each passing moment. I love you, she said quietly, the words feeling both enormous and simple. I know it is too soon. I know we barely know each other in the ways that mortals measure such things, but I do not care. I love you, Vlad Dracula. He was silent for so long that Elena wondered if she had made a mistake. Then his arms tightened around her and she heard him speak, his voice thick with emotion. And I love you, Elena Ashford. Against all wisdom, against all the oaths I swore to never allow myself such vulnerability again, I love you. You have awakened something in me that I thought had died centuries ago. You have given me hope when I believed myself beyond its reach. Elena turned in his arms to face him, seeing the wetness on his cheeks that might have been tears, though she had not known vampires could cry. "Then we will face whatever comes together," she said. "The hunters, the village, the future, all of it. Together." "Together," Dracula agreed, and sealed the promise with another kiss. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing the mountain in white. In the village below, people slept peacefully, unaware that on the mountain above them, a woman they had abandoned had found a love that transcended the boundaries of mortality itself. And in Castle Dracula, in a chamber lit only by firelight and moonlight, two beings from different worlds wrote the first chapter of a story that would defy every expectation, challenge every assumption, and prove that love could flourish even in the darkest places. The future was uncertain. Danger would come, as Dracula had warned, but tonight none of that mattered. Tonight there was only this moment, this embrace, this perfect union of mortal and immortal, human and vampire, loneliness and love. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. As dawn approached and Dracula reluctantly left her chamber to retreat to the protected depths of the castle, where sunlight could not reach him, Elena lay awake, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. She thought about the wedding that never was, about Victor's betrayal, about the long journey from that chapel altar to this bed in a vampire's castle. Every step had led her here. Every heartbreak had been necessary to bring her to this moment, to this love, to this truth. She was not the woman who had stood waiting at that altar. That Elena had been naive, trapped by expectations and limitations she had not even recognized. This Elena, the woman who now lived in Castle Dracula and loved an immortal being, was free in ways she had never imagined possible. The sun rose fully, flooding her chamber with light. In the depths of the castle, Dracula would be sleeping, sustained by the blood he had taken from willing donors in distant cities, protected from the sun's lethal rays. Tonight, when darkness fell again, he would return to her, and they would have another evening together, another night, another opportunity to build this impossible but precious thing between them. Elena smiled and closed her eyes, finally allowing sleep to claim her. Her last thought before dreams took her was simple and profound. She was home. After a lifetime of searching without knowing what she sought, she had found it. Not in a conventional marriage, not in the approval of the village, not in the safe and predictable life others had planned for her, but here in a castle on a mountain, in the arms of a creature who should have been her death, but instead had become her salvation. And that, she knew with absolute certainty, was exactly where she belonged.